Hello everyone and welcome to Azam Sharp Weekly. In the first part of building our to-do list application using SwiftUI and JSON API, you learn about fetching the data from the server. The server is implemented using Node and Express.js. Let's go ahead and work on how do we delete an item from the server. All right. Now, in order to delete an item, we need something unique about our to-do list tasks, our items. The title is not really unique and priority is definitely not unique at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get an ID and just going to provide some dummy values for it. 2 and then something else. Now, if you're building a full stack application where your application is connected to a database, then these IDs will be coming from the database. But right now we don't really have a database and we're simply using an array as our database or in-memory database. So that's why we're putting these IDs 1, 2, and 3. These are unique. So this means that each of these task object can be identified uniquely based on their ID. So now what we want to do is on our server, which is implemented in Node and JS or Express.js, we want to make sure that we can delete an item. There's no point in moving to your SwiftUI application because it is dependent on the server to remove an item from an array. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to say app.delete using the delete protocol. We are going to go ahead and pass in the URL, which is to-dos, and we're going to pass in the task ID. So this is kind of like a dynamic parameter that we are passing, which is saying that the URL should begin with to-dos, but I can pass any ID that I want. All right, so this task ID will be replaced eventually by the ID that I want to delete. How do I access this ID? Request.params.taskID. And we are going to do a parse int so that we know that this particular ID is int. And now I will get the task ID. Once I have the task ID, I can go ahead and remove that particular element from the array. So how do we remove it from the array? Well, there are many different ways you can remove it, but I like to just filter it out from the array. So I can simply say to-dos.filter. I will get the to-do item, and you will return me something where to-do.id is not equal to the task ID. And the filter is going to return you a brand new array, and we are simply going to assign it to the same array. And that's it. Now, what should we return once the item has been deleted? That's completely up to you. So this is our server, so we can return whatever, success true, and we can even say message, which is saying that item or whatever task has been deleted. It doesn't really matter what you're returning as long as you are returning something. All right. Good. Now, I have created this route where I can pass in the task ID, and it hopefully will delete that particular task with that ID that I'm passing. But still, I'm not going to jump into my SwiftUI app. I still want to make sure that this actually works. And one of the ways that you can make sure that it works is by using a tool called Postman or any other networking tool. There's also Insomnia and some other tools also. So let me go ahead and first clear out all of these things that we have. Okay, so this is Postman. It's a free app that you can download. Simply search for Postman. Let's go ahead and create a request. We will change this to delete. And now we need the URL. So let's go ahead and get the URL. The URL is kind of like the same. You can see the URL is this plus to-dos and the ID that we want to delete. So let's go ahead and launch it. To-dos and the ID want to delete is 1. All right. And that is pretty much it. Let's go ahead and open up another tab for the get request just to make sure that we can get all the to-do list items. And right now you can see that there are 1, 2, and 3 items. Let's go back to our delete. And hopefully after we have run the delete, we should get less items. So now it's saying success true. Let's go to the get again and make a request. And now we have 2 items. Let's go ahead and delete the item with the ID number 3. There we go. And now if I go ahead and do it, it's gone. Now, if I go ahead and make some changes over here, let's say if I type something over here and I save it, then the server will restart and then I will get a new copy of the server, which will include all the 3 items. So I can go to my Postman and I get 3 items. All right. Because the server has started. So this means that this is all working perfectly fine. Now the next step would be to how can we integrate this into our SwiftUI application. The other thing that we need to do in our SwiftUI application is that we have just added an ID. So it might be a good idea to get the ID also in our DTO object or our model object. All right. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go to my models, and you can see that currently our model, which is to do of the DTO object, does not really support anything called ID. So let's go ahead and add that. So now hopefully when we return back an array of to-dos with an ID 1, 2, 3, it will also be available in the to-do item. And that is a unique ID, right? So we can also go to our view models, and instead of making it identifiable, I guess we can make it identifiable. We can simply return the ID that is coming from the to-do. So that would be perfectly fine too. All right. So I can go over here and I can make the necessary adjustment so that the ID that we are returning is actually the to-do ID. So I'm just going to remove it from here for time being and add it again somewhere over here as an ID, so that we know that this ID is actually coming from somewhere else. So ID, which is integer, and this is coming from todo.id. Let's go ahead and build it, and everything should be working perfectly fine. All right, we are conforming to the protocol. We have the ID, so that should be okay. If we go ahead into our content view and run our app, it's not really going to show any difference. It's going to just get those 3 items and display these 3 items. If we want to display the priority also, if you are interested in displaying the priority, we can also do that by embedding it in an edge stack and adding the priority also. The user interface is kind of up to you, however you want it. Priority. And let's add a little bit of a spacer. There we go. Now the priority that is being sent from the server is just lowercase high, medium, and low. Now if you want the priority to be displayed in some other fashion, that is your opportunity to do it right over here. So you can see over here we have camel case or capitalize or whatever you want to do, you can do that. And that is the real power that you get from using using view model. So it's not actually working. Hold on a second. So maybe it's not capitalized. You can do uppercase or whatever you want to do. I'm not sure what capitalize is going to do over here, but let's go ahead and do uppercase, and that is going to return us a string. And hopefully it will display uppercase. There we go, high, medium, and low. Now you can do anything you want over here, critical or whatever you want to change it, that's perfectly fine, but you can see it's working perfectly fine. All right. So now the question is, well, how do we delete it? How do we want to delete an item? We have the server portion, and this is working perfectly fine. This is something that we have already done. So how do we delete an item? I should be able to just swipe from right to left and should be able to simply delete the item. All right. But how do we do that? In order to swipe from left to right, what we are going to do is, instead of using a list over here, I'm just going to send it in the next new line and going to use a for each. And I'm going to make sure that the for each is actually closing somewhere. Let's go ahead and try to do, I think I messed up somewhere. That always happens when you try to use this kind of approach. All right. All right, let's go ahead and select all of that. Yeah, sometimes it's just easier to rewrite it. So I'm just going to go ahead and rewrite this stuff. All right, here we go. For each. And we're using for each because for each over here is going to provide us the capability of showing the delete buttons. So I'm going to get the to-do item in, and I believe I can just use the stack to show the to-do item. So to-do item dot title. Let's first see that if the title is being displayed or not. I think it still doesn't like it. All right, expected. Okay. And I can also go ahead and add a bit of a spacer and going to add a to-do item dot priority, which will be in caps or in uppercase. All right, let's see what's going on. Now it's not even displaying anything. And the reason it's not displaying it because we didn't really do onAppear. And in the onAppear, we will call to-do list item dot populate items. If you don't call that, then obviously it's never really going to fetch anything. There we go. So we're back to where we got started. But with one exception, now we have for each, and we can attach different things to it. And one of those things can be on delete. You can see that on delete is going to provide you an index set that we can use. And the index set, just by implementing on delete, it gives us the power to swipe and see the delete button. See that? I mean, the delete button will not really do anything right now because this one is completely empty. You can see we're not really doing anything. But inside the delete button or inside the index set, we can do something. So index set is a like a set that we can perform a for each on it. We can go through it, and this is going to give us all the different things that we can use. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look. How do we do that? So let's go through the index set. I can use index set dot for each. I will get access to the particular index, and using the index, I can go ahead and find out which item that you are trying to delete by simply saying to-do list view model dot to-do items and passing in the index. Now we haven't really deleted any item yet, but we have found the item that you're trying to delete. So this will be the item that you're trying to delete, which is to-do item. All right. Now the actual deletion will be done in the view model. So let's go to our view model, which is controlling everything. And we will create a function. We will call it delete to-do item. And you should be able to pass in a to-do item that you want to delete, which will be of type to-do item view model. And inside this, we can delete it somehow. So let's go back. We will call to-do list view model dot delete item and simply passing in the to-do item. So there we go. We're passing in the to-do item. All right. Going back to our view model, we get the to-do item. The job of deleting an actual item, since the item is stored on the server, right here, we need to invoke this particular URL. So the web service will be responsible for deleting the item. Let's go back to the web service. The web service currently doesn't really have any function to delete anything. So we have to create delete to-do item. We will pass in the URL. Apart from the URL, we should also pass in the ID that we want to delete. So I'm just going to call it task ID, and that will be integer. And that is going to return us some sort of a completion stuff. All right. So we are going to simply say this will be of result type. whatever the completion thing that we get back, for now, we can call it like we will get back something, or we will return something. Let's say we could return Boolean if we want to, network error. I mean, just to make it simple. There we go. Let's go ahead and build it. Now, the first thing we need is the URL, right? I mean, we need to get the URL, and you can see that the URL, if you are trying to delete something, is based on the ID. So let's go back to our constants. We have one URL, but that URL is to get all the items. The delete URL is a bit different. So I'm just going to go ahead and say static function, and you can say delete task URL, which will be a function which is going to be based on the ID. So you're going to provide the task ID, and then I'm going to provide you with the URL. We will return something over here, which will be a URL string. And I can simply copy, I guess, this portion. And the ID will be injected right there. And we can force unwrap it because right now it's fine. I mean, I don't think you can send in, we're not attaching anything, we're not adding anything to it. So it should be okay. If it causes problems, then we can talk about it later. But right now, the only way to delete is to swipe. So that's the only way you can delete something. All right. Let's go back. Okay. So URL is already passed by someone. So that's perfectly fine. Next up, we will have to create a request. So URL request based on the URL that you're passing. Request.http method. And since our HTTP method is not post or not get, it will be delete, because you can see that we are using the delete protocol right there by building our JSON API. There is no body because everything is in the URL, and URL is already passed, so that should be okay. We will get your session.data task with the request. We will pass in the request. We will get the completion. We'll get the data. We'll get some sort of a response, and we will get some sort of an error, hopefully not. And then we can say resume. Inside over here, we're going to do kind of like the same exact thing that we did before. We're going to not paste it. Here we go. There we go. All right. And we are going to get some sort of a response. Let's just go ahead and mark this with escaping. There we go. All right. Now, the server is returning us something. You can see the server does return you success, true, and message. So you can create a new type and map to this if you want to. That is perfectly fine in your case. If you don't want to, then you can do something else over here. So let's go ahead and do that. I mean, it's not that hard to build some sort of a model or a response. We can use it for some other thing also. All right. So more of it's a generic response that you're getting kind of like from the server. So we should call it something like to do. Well, we can even call it like a generic response that we're getting. I mean, if you want to be a little bit more, I mean, you can call it delete response, because you are kind of like getting this when you're deleting something. If you just want to go like very modular or granular, so this is a delete response that we are getting. All right. And what are we getting in the delete response? Where we're getting a success and we are getting a message. But I think if you're going to add something or update something, probably we're going to get the same exact thing. So now it's come to you. Do you want to call it like a delete response and then insert response and then update response? Or if this response is just some very generic thing that you can just, return this. All right. So it's up to you. Let's go ahead and maybe rename this generic response. All right. So I'm just going to call it generic response, which will consist of one of this and then the message itself. Let's go back to our web service. And we're going to use JSON decoder.decode. And we're going to decode it to the generic response that we're getting. It's always going to have like a success and a message. So that's why we're calling it generic response. And then we can call it whatever, generic response or operation response, whatever operation that we provided. All right. And then finally, we can either pass it in the result, like a generic response. So this means that we can simply go ahead and say completion with a success, and we can simply pass in operation response that we are getting. All right. Now, in this case, the operation response, as you can see, it needs to be decoded, or it needs to be unwrapped. And right now, we are not unwrapping it. We can unwrap it later. So we can just go ahead and make this kind of like that. That's fine. And there we go. So that's our kind of like a generic response that we're going to get. Now let's go back to the to-do list again. And we are going to call web service dot delete item, the URL. Let's go ahead and get the URL from constants.url.delete has with an ID. Well, the ID will be to-do item.id. So that is going to get us the response. I don't think we need to pass in the ID anymore because the URL contains the ID, right? And we are going to get some sort of a result back over here. If let result equals to result. And now we can perform a switch on the result. We can have a case for success. We can have a response. We can simply go ahead and print out the response. The IntelliSense is not really working. Probably I'm doing something wrong over here, but we will go ahead and fix that. Let's see, error. And for this, we can go ahead and print out error. Let's go ahead and build this. So something is missing over here. You can see that in the web service, I was actually passing in the task ID. We don't really need the task ID because that will be the part of the URL anyways. So we don't technically need that. Okay. And over here, it should be okay. I'm not sure why it's complaining over here. Generic response. Okay, so result itself is not that. Okay, so we need to fix that part also. It's the response that is coming out to be. That is the one that is this one. That is optional. Let's go to build it. You can see that this response right over here, that is the optional part, not the whole response object. Okay. Delete to-do item. Now let's see that where do we have to call this. So I will go to our content view. It is already calling to-do view model.delete to-do item. So it's going to call delete to-do item, passing in the item we want to delete. It's going to build up the URL based on the ID, which is 1, 2, or 3 for now. It's going to get the response or some sort of a result. And then we will simply going to print the result. Let's go ahead and check out our web service if that code is correct. That looks it's fine, a very generic kind of a code, very simple to understand kind of a code. I think now our next step would be to just go ahead and run it. So I'm going to go ahead and run it in a simulator because I want to see what's going on in the console. So let's go ahead and delete this one, feed the rabbit. And we already get bad request. Something bad has actually happened. A lot of errors. Somewhere over here, I think it called bad request. Now it's gone. Let's do clean the car. Yeah, so we're getting a bad request. So something is not right. So it should be coming from over here. You can see that it is not giving us 200. So something is wrong. And let's go ahead and find out that what it is. All right, so printing out the URL, you can see that we have a problem with the URL. Let's go ahead and fix that. I think we're just missing a slash over here, so I'm just going to put a slash over here, and that should fix it right there. And let's try to run it again. Let's see if we can delete something or not. Okay, so obviously the UI is not updated, but it did send us a message. I don't know if you read the message. There's a lot of stuff going on over here, but it did deleted that. All right. We can go back to our server and check it. Let's go and check with Postman. And there we go. You can see that one item has been deleted, the feed the rabbit part. So even though it is deleted, our UI, which is right here, is not updated. You can see it's still saying feed the rabbit. So we need to make sure that our user interface is refreshing and showing us the correct one. All right. So now the question is, well, how do we do that? Well, what do we want to do when you actually delete an item? So once we actually delete the item, and if the response is actually true, so if let response equals to response, and if the response dot success, meaning if it's true, then it will be a good idea to get the items. All right, let's do self dot get all the items. So if the delete is successful, then go to the server and give me a fresh copy of all the elements, and hopefully in that fresh copy, it will not have the item that you just deleted, because it should no longer be on the server. And you can see now it's fetching only 2. But let's go ahead and start from the beginning. So I'm just going to press enter, enter, enter or something so that we get 3 items. Let's run it again. So we have 3 items. These are all hard-coded items. I'm going to go ahead and try to delete clean the car. Okay, there we go. It's refreshed. Feed the rabbit. And I can even delete this one. There we go. So all the items are deleted. Now, if I go ahead and run the app again without restarting the server, I get nothing, which is great because there are no items on the server. I deleted all of them. So there you go. That is how you will perform a delete operation when you're using a SwiftUI application and you have implemented your JSON API. One thing that is very important over here, if you are learning this for the first time, is always make sure that your server is working. You have to always make sure that when you are trying to insert something, delete something, update something, you have to work on your server first till you move to your client, till you move to your SwiftUI application. Don't just implement this and then try to test it out with the SwiftUI client or whatever client that you're building. You have to test it with some sort of a tool like Postman or Insomnia or some sort of a networking tool. Because the problem is, and this is in new developers, this is a very common problem, that you will implement this, you will never test it out, and then you will write the client to test it out. That's not a good way to do things, because now you have 2 points of failure. Your client can fail, and the problem might be in the client, maybe you missed something, but the problem might be right over here also. So it's always a good idea to use a networking tool to check your server, and when the networking tool like Postman is telling you that, okay, yeah, it's deleted, then you can move to the client, because you know that your server actually works. So hopefully that will help. And now we have covered deleting a to-do list item also. So in the next video, we'll be covering about how to add a new item. So stay tuned for that. Hey, if you love this video and want to support my channel, then the best way would be to check out my courses on Udemy. You can see here that I have a lot of different courses on Udemy, ranging from SwiftUI to MVVM design pattern to Combine, RX Swift, ARKit, React, Redux, a lot more. You can check out my brand new course on SwiftUI Cookbook, which contains over 100 recipes for building iOS application. All the links to the courses are right there in your description. You can see I have also courses on core data and advanced Swift, async, and await, which is a new feature in iOS 15, MVVM design pattern, and React, and so much more. So check out the links in the YouTube description. Thank you so much for your continuous support.